Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video, we will learn to answer one of the most asked questions in the interview, which is to explain the automation framework. So let's begin. In automation testing interviews, one of the most common questions is to explain your previous automation framework. Here, most of the candidates struggle because they are not following the structured approach to answer this question. Here, what you need to do is that you need to go step by step. The first step, you should always talk about the tech stack you are using. So, for example, you might be using Selenium with Java, you might be using the TestNG, you might be using the payable model. So, based on the tech stack you are using, you need to talk about that one on the first level. Then, on the second level, you need to talk about the project structure. You need to explain the structure of your particular project. So, folders you have, the subfolders you have, the files you have. Okay. So, based on that, you need to come to the third point where you should be talking about the execution flow. So, here you need to talk about how your code should be executed or how you executed your code, where your test files were, which commands you used in order to execute the test suits, like maybe smoke, maybe regression. Okay. Then you need to come to the best practices you followed. So you need to talk about that. You have utilized the pyramid model design pattern. You have utilized some best practices for the pipelines in CI/CD. So whatever you have utilized, so you need to talk about those particular best practices. And in the end, you need to talk about what makes your framework scalable. What were the features? How you approach for the framework to make it scalable. Now, what I will do is that I will give you a sample responses based on these points. So, first point, we'll talk about the tech stack, how you should respond to this point, then how you should explain the structure, then execution flow, best practices, and what makes it scalable. Now, here is an example of the tech stack overview. So, this is a first step. So, here you can say that you have built a modular Selenium automation framework using Java, TestNG for the execution, page update model for the design pattern, and you have managed the dependency using the Maven and generated the reports using TestNG or the extend reports. So this is a few lines. Here you have explained your tech, right? So you have used Selenium, you have used Java, you have used TestNG for the text execution, you have used page update model as a design pattern. For reports, you have either used TestNG reports or the extended reports. And in order to manage the dependencies, you have used Maven over here. Now, let's move towards the project structure explanation. So, once you have explained your tech stack, now the second step is to explain the project structure. Okay, here is an example for the project structure explanation. So, you can start like our framework was divided into the following key packages. So, first one, the base. So, basically, the purpose of base to handle the WebDriver setup and tear down, and that was done using the before method and after method. And then we have the pages. So basically, each web page has its own class with the locators and the actions. And this is basically related to the page object model. Then we have a test. So TestNG test classes that call the page methods and perform assertions. Then we have utilities where we have reusable methods like reading from the Excel, weights, screenshots, logging. So all these are being written in the utilities. Then finally we have resources where we have config.properties and testng.xml to store the configurations and to control the test flow. Okay. Now you have explained your tech stack, you have explained your project structure. Third thing is that execution flow. So let me show you the example how you can explain the execution flow. Here is an example of execution flow now. So how you can explain is that during the execution, our test class triggers a test scenario. It can be login test, registration, and so on. It calls methods from the corresponding page class. Then actions are performed like entering a username, clicking on a button. So, and once we are performing these actions, we are using assertions on top of it using the TestNG. And finally, we have the execution logs and reports are being generated post test. So basically, we are giving an idea how our execution flow works. Okay, and now let's talk about the best practices you followed during that particular project. Now, here's an example of the best practices you followed. So, first, you need to talk about the POM because it helps you to maintain the code. You have separate class to maintain the locators and the actions. So, tomorrow, if there is any change in the locator, you need to just update at one place, right? So, that's why it is known as the best practices. Okay. Then you need to talk about like weights. So, instead of you saying that I'm using thread.sleep or I used implicit weight. So you should talk about the explicit weight because it improves the reliability in your test and is not taking a longer time as compared to using the thread or sleep or the implicit weights. Then you need to talk about a best practice is that a separate layer of the utilities, right? You have separated because you need to use them again and again. Finally, you need to talk about that your framework is capable of, integrating with the Jenkins or CI/CD pipelines. You have followed the best practices for the Git and version controlling. And here, if you want to explain more around the CI/CD, you can do that. And also for the version controlling, how you are, maintaining the branches, how team is working, how team is collaborating, what kind of standards you are following in the particular project. You can talk about that. But if you go on the high level, even that's fine. And you need to talk about how the data driven testing happened using the TestNG. You use the data provider for the data driven testing. So all these are basically the best practices because they help you to make a robust framework, right? And finally, what you need to talk about is that how that framework was scalable. Okay. Now here's an example of what makes your framework scalable. So you need to talk here about that the way you design the framework, your framework supports the parallel execution, for example. Your framework supports the cross-browser testing. Your framework support easy maintenance. So easy maintenance by default. Here, the interviewer might ask, "What do you mean by easy maintenance?" Just elaborate. So obviously, you have used the page update model, so you can talk about that. Locator changes affects only one page class, and you can talk about how your framework supports the parallel execution. Does it have any specific class written for it? Are there some built-in feature? How whatever you have done, you need to explain about the parallel execution, cross-browser testing. So you can say that we have, you know, already have the drivers for Chrome, Firefox, everything is in place. We just need to call or pass to the config file, right? So whatever you have implemented, you need to talk about how the how your framework supports the parallel execution, how your framework supports the cross-browser testing, how your framework is scalable in terms of easy maintenance. Because here, easy maintenance is one of the most important thing. Because if you unable to maintain your framework, so this means that it's really hard to scale, right? And similarly, you can talk about feature integrations like tomorrow if you want to incorporate the APIs or the databases, how your framework actually supports that. So for example, you say that in terms of the APIs, we just need to import the, for example, rest assured the libraries, and again we can utilize those libraries to automate the APIs, right? The point here is that the interviewer should understand what tech stack you used, what was your structure, what was your execution flow, what makes it scalable, what best practices you used. So all these points needs to be answered when you are explaining the framework. So here the interview will get a very good idea about your understanding of the framework even The interviewer might be able to judge the level of skills you have depending on how well you're responding to this question. Okay, so in summary, always go step by step. First step, talk about the tech stack you used. Then talk about the structure. Then talk about how you're executing or what is the execution flow. Then what were the best practices you used. Then finally, how you make it scalable. Because the person who is taking an interview is want to know how, because when we are doing the automation, so we might be working on the large projects, right? Where you might need to automate from today, if there are thousands, so tomorrow it is expected to have 15,000 test cases which needs to be automated, right? So if you talk about this way, it will give an impression that you know how to scale the frameworks, right? So that's how you should respond to this particular question in the interviews.